Well, we will start with the genesis of the book, because this is quite a long story that I will make short. It all started in 2007 with an encounter with the Deputy Consul General of that time. His name was, and is still named, Christian Ramage. And both of us are very fond of history, and we were challenging each other with funny stories about French presence in Hong Kong. We were digging in some archives, and we saw that, in fact, there was a lot of things to say about French people in Hong Kong. And we did a blog. It was in 2007, 2008. And each week we were doing a little story about French presence in Hong Kong. And the Consul General at that time told us, but why are you not doing a small leaflet, a 30, 40 pages leaflet for a 14th of July, the Bastille Day, and we can give it to friends of France. We say, yeah, okay, why not? So we'll dig a bit more in the archive and in the sources. And we found out that, in fact, there was a lot of things to say. So the little 30 pages leaflet became that huge and heavy book. Unfortunately, my friend Christian, the deputy consul, left for another position, and I was alone to do that project. So that was a bit of a problem, because speaking about all kind of French presences over 150 years is quite a challenge. So we created a small editorial committee with other specialists. And I asked some specialists to write articles about specific topics. For example, a small religious congregation at the end of the 19th century, there was a specialist, he wrote an article about it. Or the French bunkers in the 1960s, there was a specialist, I asked him to write an article about it. So more or less, I wrote about 70% of that book. And on some specific subjects, I asked specialists to help me on those matters. And the book became more and more important, and I will tell you more about the iconography also, the pictures, which is a very important matter of the book, and that explains the size of the book also. And the objectives of the book were, there were both two objectives. First, to see the history of Hong Kong through an original point of view, not always the same British point of view during the colonial era. And second, it was to tell the stories, the rich and unique stories of men and women who lived here in Hong Kong over the past 150 years. So today, I would like to share this session with you with that outline. We'll speak about the pioneers, sailors and religious people, then diplomats and traders, people who led a lot of archives. I call them the official presence. And then we will finish with a much less official presence, raiders and artists. This picture is really important to start with sailors and religious people, the pioneers. This watercolor painting has been made in 1838, so 3 years before the British took over the island. And in fact, as far as I know, this is the very first representation ever of Hong Kong Island. So you can recognize easily Hong Kong Island. Oops, it's here. Hong Kong Island, and we are here from what may be Peninsula Hotel to nowadays. But you see, it's an artist view. It's not an accurate view. Probably he did it long time after he went here, because here is Stonecutters Island, but that's not true. Stonecutters Island is much more on the right in truth. So this is the first representation you have. It's not an accurate representation, but it's an interesting way of seeing the British colony, which is not yet a British colony. So before English people, there was French artists here. Auguste Bourget here, the painter, was a sailor, an officer, and he's quite important because what he did during his travels inspired a famous French writer called Honoré de Balzac. I don't know if it rings a bell. And Honoré de Balzac wrote a book about Chinese and China, inspired by the travels diary of Auguste Bourget. So that's why I want to start with him. So usually when I'm doing that kind of lectures, I'm doing a quick reminder about the history of Hong Kong, because it's not clear for everyone, but I suppose that for you it will be quite obvious. But you know that the 20th of January 1841, after the First Opium War, the British took over Hong Kong. We can discuss about this peculiar date because in fact, the 25th of January, they raised the English flag on Possession Street, but the Shenpi Convention has been officialized 1 year later in August 1842. But it's detailed. What is important is to know that on the 25th of January 1841, British people are taking over that territory. And they will develop it for many people, including French, even if British and French people are not always good friends. They developed the harbor for everybody. It was a free port. What we call a free port, they're free of taxes. So it means that everybody can make trade in Hong Kong, which is quite important, in fact. So the first to settle in Hong Kong were not traders, in fact. They were religious people. And among them, the Society of Foreign Mission of Paris, we call them MEP in French, Missions étrangères de Paris. They came in 1847 thanks to that man. He seems a little bit grumpy like that, but he seems to be a nice man, in fact. He's called, his name, Napoléon Libois. And in fact, the Society of Foreign Missions of Paris, they were before in Macau, like all congregations in Asia. They had their headquarters in Macau. But Portuguese Jesuits didn't like this congregation. So they were struggling each other all the time. So Napoleon Libois said, okay, we cannot work in Macau. Let's settle in Hong Kong. But it was a risky project because nobody trusted that Hong Kong will be a good opportunity at that time. I remember that we are in 1847 and only English people were trusting in their colony. A lot of foreign countries said that it's a dry and desert rock, nothing will rise from this desert island. They are not all visionaries. But so they settled in 1847 in Cane Road. So I suppose that it's difficult to recognize Cane Road nowadays. But this is the first headquarters of the Society of Foreign Mission in Hong Kong. And a year later, in 1848, a French bishop of Japan in Hong Kong, because the French bishop of Japan was forbidden to go in Japan, so he was in Hong Kong at that time. It's a complicated story. The French bishop of Japan, who was in Hong Kong, called the Sisters of Saint Paul de Chartres to settle in Hong Kong too. Why? Because they saw that in the Hong Kong streets there was a lot of orphans, Chinese orphans, and the Hong Kong government, the Hong Kong colonial government, did not take care of those orphans. So this bishop, he called for the Sisters of Saint Paul de Chartres, and they came in 1848. And they built the very first Hong Kong orphanage. You can see here, among all the orphans, you have sisters, French Sisters of Saint Paul. They are very important in Hong Kong because first they were settled in Wan Chai, and then in 1914 they moved in Causeway Bay, behind the Happy Valley racecourse, and they founded one of the very first orphanage, but also one of the very first hospital, very first house for old people, a house for former prostitutes. They founded a lot of social welfare institutions that were among the first in Hong Kong. So that's why they did a great job. And if you have parents that were in Hong Kong in a long time ago, until the 1970s, Hong Kong people were referring to the hospital of the sisters as the French hospital, because it was one of the most performant hospitals in Hong Kong. So then it changed because English people, they thought that it was quite a good idea to take care of people and to settle with social welfare. But at the beginning, they did not change anything. And in fact, they were encouraging sisters to settle. Why? Not because they want to encourage Catholic religion. It's because the things that they were doing here, it's something less to pay and to install as a colonial government. So here is about the Sisters of St. Paul. Another reminder about the evolution of the colony. You know that after the Second Opium War between 1856 and 1860, the British took possession of Cardone Peninsula. So here was Hong Kong Island a perpetuity contract, and then here Kowloon Peninsula, not only the atoll but the whole peninsula, with Stonecutters Island here, and it was also a perpetuity contract, which is important for what will follow, you will see. So this is a map of 1860. And at the same time, here is a painting, a watercolor painting of a French naval officer. In my opinion, this is one of the most beautiful French representation we have of Hong Kong. It has been painted in 1862. Unfortunately, this is an anonymous picture. We only know that this is a French naval officer, but we don't know anything else about it. But you can see that we are in 1860, and the city starts to grow on the mountain, and the city is developing quite fast, in fact. So, one very important point, it would be untrue to say that relations between France and Hong Kong were always smooth and made of a beautiful friendship. We have one story that tells us the contrary. The story of the Galissonière, this French vessel, in 1883 has been the start of a very important event in Hong Kong. To make the story quite short, in 1883, the Admiral Courbet organized a few military raids in China. He killed a lot of Chinese with his vessels, especially in the north of Taiwan. There is a battle called the Battle of Tengshui. Sorry for my Chinese. It's north of Taipei. And the French vessels killed something like 3,000 Chinese people. And then they came back to Hong Kong to make some repairs and to fix the boat. They have been warmly welcomed by the British authorities. For once, we were allied. And the Vice King of Canton, the Vice King of Guangzhou, was really angry at the French. So he called at a boycott. He said, you have to boycott French interests in the British harbor of Hong Kong. And the dockers, the stevedores of Hong Kong, followed his order, and nobody wanted to work for French people and for British people. And this is one of the very first strikes in Hong Kong, in the Hong Kong history. It's a way to import French savoir-faire. But more seriously, this is also one of the very first colonial, anti-colonial movement in the history of Hong Kong. So thanks or because this vessel, the French Galissonière, we have in the following months an anti-colonial movement, a riot against the British and their authorities, which is quite interesting when you want to observe the history of Hong Kong social movements. But in fact, this is the only story I found about some problems between France and Hong Kong. Mostly the stories that I have to tell today are positive stories, and the one about the Bohemia is also a nice one. This man was a French priest. He's called Jean-Marie Delavet, and in 1888 he was having a promenade around Pok Fulam, and he was also a botanist, and he saw a flower that was about to be extinct in Hong Kong, and he cultivated this flower and he drew it. And this flower is the Boinia that everybody knows. And thanks to him, because he cultivated that flower and he saved it from extinction, in 1965, British people at that time and Hong Kong people choose it as the Boinia that we have on the Hong Kong flag. I don't know that if British people knew that it was coming from a French priest at the beginning, but the facts are here, and it's a nice story. Speaking of Society of Foreign Missions and French priests, again, a few words about buildings and heritage buildings in Hong Kong nowadays. Here is Bethany in Pok Fulam. You may recognize those buildings because they are still erected nowadays. Bethany was a sanatorium for French priests who needed rest. You know, at that time, French missionaries, they were leaving France for life, in fact, or for 10 years, 20 years. And a mission in China was really exhausting. And when they were sick or when they needed rest, they came back to Hong Kong and they stayed in this beautiful building here, which is called Bethany. And you have some French missionaries here. This has been erected in 1875, and in 1894 they had this building here, you know. There is a chapel here, and they had this building here in 1894. And this is a printing house. And in fact, because those missionaries were men of action, they were really bored in Hong Kong, in the sanatorium. So they missed some action. And the French priests, they give us a work, and the work was a printing house, and they printed a lot of books, mostly religious books. And that has been quite important in the printing industry in Hong Kong, because most of the early printers in Hong Kong have been trained in the Nazareth printing house from 1894 to 1953. So this was about religious companies, and you see that those buildings are still well alive today. This is the Hong Kong Performing Art Chapel. If you want to see, there is sometimes some concerts. And this is owned nowadays by HKU. And last update about Hong Kong evolution, you know that on the 30th June 1898, Russian, French, German, they claimed some new territories in China. And this is exactly the same time when France claimed Fort Bayard, just north of Hainan. It is now Guangzhou. Guangzhou? Yes, the pronunciation is good. And this was a new territory for French people. So the British said, okay, we want also a new territory. And they had a new territories because they claimed the rest of what we know in Hong Kong nowadays. It means 80% of the actual size of Hong Kong. But that time, it was not a perpetuity contract. It was a 99 years lease. And you know the rest of the story because it is Hong Kong history and not related to France. But this is very important to see that because Hong Kong increased, French presence and European presence, Western presence increased also because the harbor was more and more important. And here is a view. In fact, there is a newspaper, a French newspaper, related the story of the extension of Hong Kong. And to illustrate this expansion, we had this picture of Hong Kong. So this is Hong Kong Harbor in 1898. And we see that the city is still expanding more and more. And this is the occasion to speak about diplomats and traders now, which is a much more easy presence to tell about because we have a lot of archives about that kind of presence. Diplomats are writing a lot, of course, and traders, they let a lot of archives with their trade. So we know a lot of things about those people. So let's talk about the diplomatic presence first. at the beginning, like I said, French people did not trust Hong Kong. Like I told you, it was supposed to be a dry and desert rock, and French diplomatic people, they said, no need to settle over there, it will fail quite quickly. So in the first years, we had no career diplomat in Hong Kong. We had what we call an honorary consul, or a consular agent, which is not a real career diplomat. This is a kind of man quite respectable enough to be representative of the France, to represent France, but he is not a career diplomat. So the first one, in August 1849, was George Louis Haskell, and not George like in French, George, because he was an American citizen, but the French ministry said his mother was French, so the honor was safe. He's an American citizen, an American trader, but why not a French as a consular agent? I found the correspondence of the French ministry at that time, and this is quite funny because he said that the French merchants he found in Hong Kong were, I will tell you in French and then I will try to translate, the French merchants here were fiefés coquins, which could be translated like scoundrels. So it means that nobody can trust those merchants, and he preferred to trust an American citizen to represent French diplomatic interest. But in the 1960s, as Hong Kong became more and more important, France changed her opinion about Hong Kong, and they sent the first career diplomat in October 1862, and you have his appointment letter from the French ministry at that time. His name was Ernest Napoleon Godeau. He was 29, and it was his very first position as a consul. So I can tell you, because I read all his first letters, he was completely lost in Hong Kong. He went from Paris, 29, directly to Hong Kong. The poor guy, the first years were not so easy for him. But this is the beginning of the diplomatic presence in Hong Kong, and it became more and more important. And in the 1930s, so we are going fast in the time, the French trade increased. There is a strong link between French diplomatic presence and, of course, French economic presence. And what changed a lot the opinion of French people on Hong Kong trade, those men are French bourgeois from Lyon. They were representing the French Chamber of Commerce. And in 1895, they made a great trip over China for 1 year, and they visited all harbors or all interesting places of China for trade. And they came back with a 1,200 pages book. And in that book, they said one thing very important for us: Hong Kong is a place to be for trading with China. And then, after 1895, it became more and more important, and French traders came in Hong Kong to make business. So those French bourgeois from Lyon, they started to change the opinion of French people about Hong Kong. And then you already had French bunkers. So you have here the building of the Comptoir d'Escompte de Paris in 1862, which is the ancestor of BNP Paribas, which is still in Hong Kong. And in 1894, you have the Bank of Indochina, Banque de l'Indochine, which is nowadays in Hong Kong, CACIB, Crédit Agricole, Crédit Lyonnais, which is now CACIB. They are quite very important in Hong Kong nowadays. This picture is from 1910 or 1911, if I remember well. We have the ancestor of the open space in a beautiful building. It was in Queen's Building, for those who remember, no, because it has been destroyed in the 1960s. But Queen's Building is now where the Mandarin Oriental stand. So Bank of China. We had many different kind of businesses in Hong Kong. Great businesses and also small businesses. You have here, for example, the Banque Industrielle de Chine, which is a small business. You also had it was a Sino-Russian Bank, which was a French bank, like the name could say. And the French interests are multiplying among the years. This is an interesting picture because in the 1920s, French people tried to get some contract to build a railway between Kowloon and Guangdong. And they failed because British people did not want French people to build a strategic railway in Hong Kong. So they did everything to avoid a French company to do the railway at that time. But one more example is the architect's example. It is a very funny thing. Over 30 architects' firms in 1931, 8 were owned by French people. So you have a lot of buildings in Hong Kong, very old buildings. There is not a French touch on those buildings, but in fact they have been built by French architects. A very simple example here is Queen's Road, not Queen's Road, Prince Edward Road on Kowloon. And you have those buildings here. They've been built in 1930. And nowadays, you can still see them. They are standing. And just here, between two apartments, you have Art Deco decorations that are quite nice, in fact. Well, this is a detail. I come back with my diplomats because the more there is economic interest, the more there is diplomats. So now we come back on diplomats. And this is the French consular seal in 1930. And I would like to speak about two specific diplomats. I like them very much. I spend a lot of time with them in the archives, so I have a link, a bond with them. This one is named Gaston Liébert. He's quite interesting because he stayed in Hong Kong for 15 years, which is quite unusual even at that time. I don't know why. I wonder if the French ministry forgot him in Hong Kong. But he was an interesting guy because in 15 years he had a lot of link with Hong Kong society, British and Chinese people, and he wrote a lot of things about how Hong Kong developed. So that was quite interesting to see. And my favorite, Georges Dufort de la Prade. Why is he my favorite? Is because he's very, very talkative. And for an historian, when you are doing history, to have a guy like him writing a lot, giving a lot of information. At that time, yes, I suppose that he was quite boring for his superiors and colleagues in Paris because they had to read a lot on long letters. But nowadays, he is a very precious. And he was a poet. So sometimes in his correspondence, no offense for the consular representative here today, but sometimes diplomatic correspondence can be quite boring, and sometimes he was sending a poem, a poetry with his correspondence, which is quite nice, in fact. So Georges Dufort de la Prade. I found a trace. I can tell you the story in 1 minute because I found his trace. I was really, really, really eager to know more about him, but in the diplomatic archives there is not a lot about his personal file. So I said, okay, Dufort de la Prade is not a very common name in France. So I took the yellow pages in France and I typed on Google yellow pages, Dufort de la Prade. There was 43 of them in France and I called them one by one. And until the 17, he answered to me and he said, I think it's my grandfather. So can you call my mother and she will tell you more about him, etc. And then I found a lot of archives about this family. And I was very, very happy to find more about them, and especially him. A proof that diplomatic presence is more and more important at the turn of the century is that house. Here, is a residence of the French Consul General with the French flag here in mid-levels. The residence has been bought in 1908, and it has been the residence of the French consul until 1982. So for a very long time, in Hong Kong, one of the most beautiful houses of mid-levels was the residence of the French consul. And this was a very beautiful house, a magnificent house. Unfortunately, it has been destroyed in 1983. Now it's a dynasty court in mid-levels. So huge buildings. That's history. So that was the proof that France wanted to be present in Hong Kong and to show it. And in fact, the French community became more and more dynamic too. Here is a picture. I will show you a few pictures about Hong Kong community, French community, but I cannot tell all the stories about them. But this is a baptism of a little Pierre Pasquet in 1906. So you have a French community, a part of the French community in 1906. Look at the clothes. We are in March. I know that in March in Hong Kong it is not so hot, but can you imagine wear that kind of clothes, especially for women with a corset, no? In the middle of Hong Kong in 1906. That was quite crazy. A bunch of child in 1938. I like this picture very much because I met that little boy and that little girl. Of course, they were grown up. They are more than 80 years old nowadays. And I met them, and they are still in contact together. They are still friends more than 75 years later. And this boy, his family has a very impressive history. To make it short, I want to share it with you because this is quite surprising. His grandfather was a French military officer in the eastern part of France, Alsace in French. And you know that in 1870 we were at war against Germany, or what was Germany at that time, and Germany took over this eastern part of France. And as he was coming from this eastern part of France, his career as a military officer was frozen. Because nobody trusted anymore a guy coming from Alsace. So he quit the French army and he sold his services to the Japanese emperor. At that time, we are in the middle of the Meiji era, and Japan is modernizing in every kind, and especially its army. And his grandfather became an instructor for the Japanese army. If you saw The Last Samurai, the movie with Tom Cruise, in fact, this is based on his story. He was a Western instructor for Japanese army. And then he settled in Indochina. He has two sons. One became a journalist in Shanghai, and the other became the head of the French liner agency, the Messagerie Maritime. The French liner, all the boats, vessels coming in Hong Kong. He was the head of the Hong Kong agency. And they had a very sad destiny because during Japanese occupation, the guy in Shanghai, the brother in Shanghai, has been killed by Japanese. And he, his father in Hong Kong, he was a resistant. And when he has been arrested by Japanese police, he showed to the Japanese police Japanese seal that his father gave him because the Emperor of Japan gave him to his father. So he was safe, and he continued to do his resistance activity in Indochina, and unfortunately it worked once but not twice, and he committed suicide before to be tortured by Japanese Kampetai. So we could do a movie about the history of that family. It's really, really impressive. So for once I can share this story, so I do it. I will be a bit quicker on the others stories. A French banker here with his wife and his sister, and again Georges Dufort de la Prade. I like him, so I put it twice. With his family, 4 children. And because we were speaking about the Japanese, we have to evoke that dark page of the Hong Kong history. You know that the 8th of December 1941, Japanese invaded Hong Kong. We are always speaking about Pearl Harbor, but for us, more important than Pearl Harbor, there is the invasion of Hong Kong. And started at that time the Battle of Hong Kong that finished with Black Christmas, 25 December 1941. Japanese invaded Hong Kong. And since 2 years, we are in 1942, since 2 years, French people were already struggling against their own government. Because you know that Germany invaded France in 1940, and France has been divided in two parts. Those who followed Maréchal Pétain with Germany, and those who followed General de Gaulle in London with the Free French Forces. And in Hong Kong, because we were in a British territory, all the French community followed General de Gaulle. So we were in Hong Kong, isolated with China, with the embassy in China that was for Maréchal Pétain, Indochina, French Indochina, that was for Maréchal Pétain, and alone, here in Hong Kong, the French community and the French consul. And the history of the French consul at that time is great also, and he was very brave. He was an old man, and he sent correspondence, letters, to everybody with a V of victory, with a violet stamp like this. And each time he was writing to his superiors in Beijing or in Indochina, he put that violet stamp V as victory. And I found the same letters from the Indochinese or Beijing archives, and you have civil servants that try to erase the victory stamp all the time. That was a way to resist because he was very old, but in fact he made some brave acts because they closed the French consulate. Of course, they wanted him to go away, and he continued to do his diplomacy work on his own money. So he paid all the personnel, the staff of the French consulate with his own money in order to have a French consulate faithful to General de Gaulle and not to Maréchal Pétain, which was quite nice. But there was another kind of commitment against Japanese, a much more physical commitment. During Battle of Hong Kong, in fact, there was few English soldiers. Maybe you know that. It was mostly Australian soldiers and Canadian soldiers. Mostly Canadian soldiers. They suffered a lot in the Battle of Hong Kong. And what we called the Corps of Voluntary Defense, Defense Voluntary Corps. And this Defense Voluntary Corps was made of everybody who wants to join, and French people. And we know that at least 30 people, 30 French people were in this regiment, in this corps, and some of them were killed during the Battle of Hong Kong. We have nowadays in the Stanley Military Cemetery, Stanley Military Cemetery, a monument for those French people who have been killed trying to defend Hong Kong against Japanese. There's a lot of stories about them too. There is one that jumped over a window to avoid to be tortured by the Japanese. There is another one that has been killed on Repulse Bay beach, and then his body has been cremated, but he had a lot of grenades in his pockets. So when he has been cremated, he was dead already, but he killed 5 Japanese around him because of his grenades. So there is a lot of war stories like that related to the French during the Battle of Hong Kong. But they have been very brave because you have to consider that they are not defending their own territory. This is not a French colony. They are defending an idea of freedom, and I think this is quite impressive, and it's forced to respect. And after the war, it became more and more tricky to to penetrate in China, especially after 1949. And when China became more inward-looking, more self-absorbed, those who loved this country had to come in Hong Kong to observe the evolution of the territory and to observe China. We call them China Watchers. So there is famous French China Watchers, a military officer like Jacques Guilhermaz, diplomats like André Travers, journalists like Lucien Baudard, is a famous French journalist, this great guy, or writers like Joseph Kessel. And all those people are what we call China Watchers. And last but not least, I would like to finish with raiders and artists, another forms of presence, less documented presence. We know few about them because sometimes this is the kind of people that let few documents, or they don't want to let any document if they are here for illegal purpose, which was the case sometime. And you have to consider that it was quite an adventure to come in Hong Kong in the 19th century and even in the first half of the 20th century. The French press in France fed people with pictures of Hong Kong that were horrid and frightening, especially with piracy, for example. So it was dangerous to come in Hong Kong. And it was very long to come in Hong Kong. Until 1938, it takes 29 days sailing from Marseille to Hong Kong. A complete whole month to go from Marseille to Hong Kong. So this is not an easy journey to do. This is an expensive journey. And this is also something that not everybody wants to do. So that was quite complicated to come in Hong Kong up to the first half of the 20th century. So often, people coming in Hong Kong are people who want to fly away very far from France because they don't want France to look for them. So a lot of smugglers and crooks. This is not special to French presence. I prefer to tell you first. There was also American, Japanese, Italian, German crooks and smugglers. Hong Kong is a free port, like I said. So, of course, all kind of dubious people were coming in the Hong Kong harbor. So you have a few examples. I like them. Here is Father Vaguet, is a fake priest. He was trying to steal money from the Chinese bourgeoisie that became Catholic, and so he was a fake priest. Here is my favorite one, Francis Vetch. It would be too long to tell you about him, but I wrote about him in the book. His story, we could do a novel about his story. Here, he's not a crook, but he's a clandestine in Hong Kong. He founded in Hong Kong the Indo-Chinese Communist Party with a guy called Ho Chi Minh, because I suppose that you know Ho Chi Minh. And in 1930, him and Ho Chi Minh, they were clandestinely in Hong Kong, and they were disguised as a football supporter in the Kai Tak football field. And they founded the Indo-Chinese Communist Party together here in Hong Kong, which is quite an important event because this is the start of the communist riot against French colonial power in Indochina. And he organized his own death in Hong Kong because Stalin's spies were after him, they were chasing him. So Stalin's spies were about to kill him. So before to be killed by Stalin's spies, he organized his own death. And the guy who helped him to exit from Hong Kong was André Malraux, a famous French writer. So there is a lot of stories about him. And normal crooks, you can see on their face that they are not very funny people. This is a Corsican smuggler. You know, at that time, smugglers were selling especially weapons for the civil war in China and opium. So this is a Corsican. Him and his brother did a lot of bad things in Hong Kong. Much more positive in another way, travelers. This is very important to talk about travelers quickly, because those travelers, they came in Hong Kong. At that time, we don't take pictures, but we take impressions, and they bring those impressions back to France. So if people in France have an idea of what Hong Kong looked like at that time, it's because French travelers were writing books about what they were doing. So we have an interesting, because we are in a book fair, so I have to talk about it quickly. At the turn of the century, we had writing travelers. It means that any travelers can write a book, because it was so exceptional to travel in the Far East that even if you did nothing, you have things to say. For example, the Comtesse Marguerite du Bourg de Bozas, here is a lady. She can write one complete page about the discovery of mango. That was very, very surprising at that time. So she's writing one page about the texture of the fruit, the taste of the fruit. That was very not common. And this is the same with Edmond Coteau here. He's writing some everyday life scenes. He's talking about everyday life scenes. And this is very, very surprising for French people at that time. We are in 1880 for him and 1885 for the lady. But after the First World War, this is not so common to travel, but the impressions, the ideas about Hong Kong are already settled in the minds in France. So we are waiting for more than everyday life impressions. That's why we will have not writing travelers, but traveling writers. It means people who know to write, famous writers, and they came in Hong Kong and they give their impression about the city. Some famous French writers, here is Marc Chadourne, the bad guy here with his strange look is André Malraux. You have the silhouette of Jean Cocteau. We had a beautiful exhibition about Jean Cocteau in Hong Kong last year. Joseph Kessel, Paul Morand, Gabriel Engoulevent, they all came in Hong Kong in the 1920s, 1930s, and they wrote about Hong Kong, and they give very fine and detailed impression about Hong Kong. And last but not least, this is the forbidden part of the lecture. I will explain to you why. It was the same with photographs. The first people coming here with camera, but you have to imagine cameras in the 1840s or 1850s. It's huge cameras. And those people are shooting everyday life scenes. And you can see those pictures. This is the very first picture of Hong Kong ever, even French or I don't know, English or German. This is the very first picture of Hong Kong ever. Probably 1844 or 1846. Why I said this is the forbidden part of the lecture, it's because when we prepared the book, I told you at the beginning that we had a great help from the French consulate. I will explain myself right now. It's because I gathered a lot of documents and pictures, more than 800 pictures about Hong Kong from 100 different sources. I was naive, and this was my very first project of that kind. And I didn't know at that time that we need copyrights. We needed rights for the owners, those who kept, those who reproduced, and we needed to sign lots and lots of contracts. And it was absolutely, I was panicking because it was too complicated for me. Usually, you know, that kind of coffee table book, you have 5 to 10 sources. Here you have more than 100 sources. So you can imagine the administrative paperwork related to this book. And thanks to the help of the French consulate, among many other things, we succeed to present all the pictures we needed in this book. That's why at the beginning the size of the book was quite modest. And when we saw all the pictures we had with all the authorizations, we said, okay, let's do something big because the pictures needed it. 80% of the pictures you have in that book are unreleased in Hong Kong. It means this is new material coming from private archives, mostly. And that's why at the beginning I told you that I was very proud to share it with Hong Kong people. It's because this is something I want to show to Hong Kong people. This is not only French presence. This is Hong Kong history, thin by French people. And if you have the occasion to see the pages of the book, you will see that there is beautiful pictures. Unfortunately, there is 3 pictures we had no permission to put in the book. So I will show it to you because we had no permission to reproduce. So this is the very first pictures in 1844. And this is 2 other pictures from 1877 with the Hong Kong harbor, you can see, and here Chinese coolies on a pass in Hong Kong. Well, this is on that picture I would like to finish this sharing session. You understand that the purpose of the book and the purpose of the talk today is not to say that Hong Kong was nothing without French presence. It's not true, that's not relevant. But I suppose that in a cosmopolitan city like Hong Kong, this is a very important matter to know more about all the different communities. This is the French testimony of the French contribution in Hong Kong, and I hope this is the beginning of other and different works. Thank you.
Thank you, Francois, for the inspiring sharing and the precious history lesson that you have given us today. And we now move to the Q&A session. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask our speaker now. So Mr. Francois will be giving out 2 complimentary copies of the English version of his book today. So each of the first 2 guests to ask questions will receive 1 copy. Please do not hesitate to raise your questions now.
You can ask me if I'm fine, that will be okay.
Hello, Mr. Franco, nice to meet you. I would like to know what attracts the French people to visit Hong Kong in the past and now?
That's a tough question because, as you can see, there is different kinds of French people and they are attracted by different purposes. You know, religious people, they were attracted by Hong Kong because it was a safe place and a safe refuge when we were doing missions all over China. Hong Kong was a safe place. Diplomats, they were coming here because it's always a nice thing to have an eye on the English activities. It's good to check what they are doing. And so that was the interest for the French diplomats. But traders, how can you imagine after the First World War in the 1920s and until nowadays, how can you imagine being in Asia doing trade with China without being in Hong Kong? This is true nowadays, but that was true at the beginning of the century. So, you know, they have different purposes. Yeah, really different. But nowadays, you know, the French consulate will tell me if I'm wrong, but we have officially more than 11,000 French people, French citizens, registers at the French consulate. So it means something like 17,000? 17,000 French national. It's huge. And they are doing many, many different things in Hong Kong. It's because this is the place to be.
Any questions else?
It seems to me that if after the handover, it's more and more French people in Hong Kong. Is it right?
Honestly, I'm not sure this is related to the handover, because if you look at the curve of the French national presence, it's always increasing. And in 1995, you have a slight decrease, because everybody was afraid of what could possibly be the handover and after. And in 1998, it started again, and we have the same figures than in 1995, and it's continuing to increase. It's difficult to say if there is a relation between the two, because French trade is more and more dynamic in France also. So it's a bit complicated to say that there is a bound between handover and the French presence. You know, for example, in the 1950s, French people were among were the very first community to have the best increase of population. Why? This is very simple. After 1954, French is losing Indochina. And you have a lot of French people from Indochina. They've never been to France. They're born and raised in Indochina. They don't know anything about France. Will they come back to France because they lost Indochina? No. They stay in the area. And the closest place to make trade and staying in Asia is Hong Kong. So that's why many French people arrived in Hong Kong in the 50s, and then in the 70s after the fall of Saigon and the fall of Phnom Penh. And you see, those events, for example, are much more relevant than the handover for the French community.
I have a further question answered. Is that in my knowledge, it seems that the early French, quite as important of them is come from missionaries. Is it right?
Sorry?
The early French to Hong Kong is for missionary.
Yeah, missionaries. First, they were sailors. Sailors were the very first to come in Hong Kong. We have in the diplomatic archives in France a beautiful map. We reproduce it in the book. A map made by sailors in 1760. A detailed map of Hong Kong. What was Hong Kong at that time? In 1760, it was sailors that came in Hong Kong, 2 centuries before the British presence. And then, of course, religious people, missionaries, they came, like I explained before.
Hello, thank you for your interesting talk today. Do you think the French artists who came here to Hong Kong has affected the Hong Kong art scene?
It's a tricky question because French artists are more and more numerous since the 1960s, 1970s, and of course some Hong Kongese artists have been inspired by French culture, but not because French culture came in Hong Kong. Mostly this is Hong Kong artists that came in France to be inspired by French network, especially. Now, can we say that French artistic presence in Hong Kong inspired local culture? I would like to think yes, because when you see over the past decades, it's not because I'm French that I will say that, but there is an incredible number of French exhibitions, French artists, since the 1960s. We often say in the 1960s, 70s, 80s that Hong Kong was a cultural desert. But when you look at all the French artists that came, the French exhibitions, the French movies that has been shown in Hong Kong, I would like to say, no, a lot of French artists came here. So for sure they inspired a part of Hong Kong cultural scene. I think so. But this is my personal opinion. This is not an historical judgment based on facts. This is my opinion of what I've seen. And,
Merci.
Any other questions? So if there are no more questions from the floor. One more.
Oui, Oui, bonjour. C'est plutôt un commentaire et une question. Est-ce que les photos, les archives sont disponibles au public en général? Et aussi sur le sujet de Ho Chi Minh, c'est plutôt un commentaire, mais est-ce que son séjour à Hong Kong est court? Et deuxièmement, parce que comme Deng Xiaoping, je pense qu'il va étudier ou travailler en France, parce qu'il va travailler. Je ne savais pas où j'ai lu ça, mais il va travailler à Ritz-Carlton à Paris. Donc, ça a changé son idée de gouvernement ou tout ça. Donc, j'aimerais savoir, est-ce que son séjour est court à Hong Kong? Et parce que la raison pour laquelle je pose la question est parce que maintenant, la tension entre la Chine et le Vietnam est un peu piquée. Mais Ho Chi Minh était très ami avec Zhou Enlai et Deng Yingqiu. Donc, deux leaders de parti communiste. Et de plus, ils parlent cantonais. Donc, j'aimerais savoir. Maybe I will translate. So I was asking him whether the archives or whatever information is available to the public. And secondly, I asked him, he mentioned Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh, actually, I read somewhere that he was like Deng Xiaoping. He studied and worked in France, but then he worked at a Ritz-Carlton hotel in Paris. That probably changed his political point of view. And then the reason why I asked about Ho Chi Minh is the China-Vietnam kind of tension these days. But Ho Chi Minh actually spoke Cantonese. And Ho Chi Minh was very close to Zhou Enlai and Deng Yingqiu. Yeah.
First question about the archives. You know, like in France, all public archives are open to public. So most of the archives that are here are half public archives, so available to everybody, and some of them, half of them are private archives, so it means that it depends of the owner. But this is what I'm particularly proud of about this book, is that as it lasts for 4 years, the editorial committee, and it has been 4 years of research, it let me some time to dig and to ask for contacts and ask for many people everywhere. And I had some archives, like I told you with Georges Dufort de la Prade, sometimes it was pure random. I called people and I say, are you related to that guy that was in Hong Kong in the 1930s? You can imagine the impression of some people on the phone. That was quite funny sometimes. And I had a lot of chance with many people. So private archives, they are not open to public, but this is now open to public in a way because you have it in the book. Now, about Ho Chi Minh, did he stay long in Hong Kong? Longer than he expected, because his stay in Hong Kong was supposed to be a few days, just to meet Jean Crémet in order to create in the Chinese Communist Party. He has been arrested by the English authorities, and the French were very happy of it, because at last they jailed Ho Chi Minh. So he stayed in jail for 2 months in Hong Kong, and then started a diplomatic problem between France and England, because France said, okay, give it to us. We want him back to Indochina, and we will deal with him. Don't worry, we will deal with him. And the English authorities said, okay, but what do you want to do with him? Because as he is a threat to Indochina, we don't want you to kill him. No, for sure, we don't kill him, but we want him to be jailed. And you know, this is diplomatic relationship. Not that the British were very kind with Ho Chi Minh. They didn't care about Ho Chi Minh, in fact. But as long as they have a way to pressure France, that was nice for them. So he stayed here for 3 months, 1 month free and 2 months in the Hong Kong prison in Central. He was jailed in the Central Police Station in Hong Kong. And you're right, a lot of Chinese and Asian revolutionaries did their studies in France. Some nice and some less nice, because Pol Pot too in Cambodia did his studies in France, and Ho Chi Minh and Deng Xiaoping. You know, we had in the 1920s, 1930s, especially with the University of Lyon, some contract with China to help Chinese students to come make their studies in France. So the Messageries Maritimes, the liner companies, they were giving free tickets to Chinese students in third class to go to France. Why? It's because Chinese students, they can speak French then, and if they speak French, it's good for French trade in China. So that was the way of the French diplomacy at the time, and maybe it's still the case nowadays. And it's a good thing to develop diplomacy with culture and languages better than weapons and other things, I think.
Any more questions? So if there are no more questions from the floor, this is the end of the seminar. Copies of Mr. Francois Dremeau's books are available for purchase at the counter outside the room. Mr. Francois also welcomes book lovers to line up in the center aisle for autographs. Before you leave, please fill in and return the questionnaire to our staff at the reception counter. Once again, on behalf of Hong Kong TDC, French Consulate General, we thank our speaker and all of you for joining us today.